now that you're the one editing, I guess I don't have to care as much about, you know, whether, how much time I waste before we actually get into our conversation, right?
Yeah, that's true. I'll always be there to cut out all the silly things you say, Mike.
I'll be sure to read your book on podcasting theory, Jacob. There.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
All right, well, welcome everybody to this episode of the Voyage podcast, where I guess it hasn't been made clear yet. We're going to be talking about the apocalypse, which is very fitting for this month of November, whether Jacob wants to admit it or not. We're getting closer and closer to the end of the liturgical year, the liturgical cycle. And so we've been kind of going through some of these themes that are, again, believe it or not, Jacob, related to the apocalypse.
I've decided that November is just kitchen sink month here at the Voyage podcast, in which Mike uses this excuse that the liturgical calendar is coming to an end, just throw out ideas that we didn't get to the last year, and so we're just going to do it all at the end kind of thing.
Isn't that kind of, I mean, I guess you wouldn't quite call it spring cleaning. You could call it fall cleaning, but
yeah, I guess so.
It's one of those things, you have a purging at the end of the year so that you can get ready to accumulate a bunch of new stuff in the next year. I mean, isn't that what Christmas is?
Talk about the purge? Are we going to talk about the purge in this episode?
Not in this episode, although it does kind of fit a little bit with our scapegoat, because I mean, isn't that very much a scapegoat mechanism? Is the Purge movies? So
that is exactly what that is about. Maybe we will.
Yeah,
boy, howdy.
I mean, I haven't seen any of them, to be honest, so I couldn't really. I mean, I know the concept obviously, because I mean, it's become a 7 movie phenomenon now.
I know. Is this where I admit that I haven't actually? Horror guru Jacob hasn't actually watched any of the Purge movies.
I think it's just because you have taste is probably what you're. I feel like everybody kind of knows. There might maybe the first one was clever, but then I feel like haven't people said they've kind of become trashy, but I know I shouldn't badmouth it either, because I would have been the first one to like roll my eyes at a horror movie, and now as Jacob knows, I've been converted. I think they're really a lot of them can be really.
They tend to be pretty good social commentary movies, and they have philosophical positions, and
they might be the most mythological of the movie genres, to be honest. Like, I was kind of thinking about that.
They certainly are.
They are trying to be the most overtly mythological, which of course I'm going to have an appreciation for. So,
fantasy and sci-fi also is obviously in that camp. And honestly, there are some categorizations where they'll actually all just get lumped together, where it's just like fantasy is both just like sci-fi and horror, and it's just all under like the fantasy label or something like that.
I've actually, I'll probably always remember this conversation that I had with one of my college professors. And it was a literature class, but it wasn't the turning your nose up literature class. It was a young adult literature, because I was studying to be a teacher. So we had to do the young adult literature. And I remember saying to her that the fantasy is the best genre of book because it's the one that's closest to the Gospels. And I didn't realize it at the time. And again, I wasn't even trying to be have a hot take or whatever, but
you're just trying to call Jesus fake, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I was going to a conservative evangelical school, actually. So I wasn't even trying to. No, it was because, again, they pick up on the mythological.
The mythic.
I mean, again, fantasy. Yeah, the mythic is there very clearly in both of those. And if you don't believe us, go back to our. If you can stomach the audio quality of the Two Heroes Journey episodes, we definitely go through how Jesus fulfills a lot of those checkpoints of the hero's journey.
Is this an opportunity? Is this an opportunity for me to personally apologize for how much those first 2 episodes suck? Origin story is fine. We actually recorded Origin story after the first 2 episodes. That's why it's technically better as far as like a form of entertainment than the first 2 episodes.
Jacob still hadn't quite bought in to the concept yet. I was still kind of dragging him along, and then it was afterwards.
At the middle of the night. We were recording those things in the middle of the night because Mike's a night owl.
Excuses.
Yeah,
so,
and And so I was like, "This is past my bedtime," um, which is a good movie reference. But anyway, for
So
those who know,
and I should say too, I'm getting back into this more because my students right now, we just sort of finished going through a unit on Jesus and the hero's journey too. So I'm corrupting the youth just like I am you and our listeners, Jacob.
hopefully, those conversations were more entertaining than our conversations were for this podcast.
It isn't 10:30 at night, but they're somehow just as tired as you were. Takes
All right.
just as much work to wake them up.
Uh huh.
So yeah, we're going to get into the apocalypse, how it's presented in a lot of movies, maybe some literature and stuff, but pop culture in general, and then how that sort of compares, you could say. Now, this isn't meant to be like, does it match up with exactly what I think the Bible is saying? Because if that was the case, then that there's no fun in that. What we're trying to do is look at some of these bigger themes, these bigger ideas that are present in, you could almost say, all apocalypse stories, or apocalyptic stories in one form or another, and how they can sort of be cleverly presented to us, the viewer. What do you think about that, Jacob?
So the word apocalypse famously has kind of like two different connotations depending upon what group you're talking to. I think in the
Mm,
pop culture mind, apocalypse just means end of the world. Just full
yeah.
stop. It's just the end of the world, right? And of course they
Chaos,
get that.
anarchy. Yeah.
And they get that from the fact that the Bible, the apocalypse of Saint John in the Bible, or the book of Revelation, is about the end of the world, right? And so I'm not blaming pop culture for feeling that way. But long since the actual meaning of apocalypse has been lost to the collective imagination, which is to
Mm,
say that it's about a revelation. It's about the revealing of truth and things like that, which is why it's called revelation in especially Protestant Bibles. But I mean, every Christian refers to it as either revelation or the apocalypse. No one has a problem with that.
mm,
But
yeah.
revelation is more accurate. Like, I mean, it's more
Mm.
accurate to our popular um, uh, euphemism. The way we use the word revelation in
Revealing, yeah. It's
yeah,
more
it's
closely
that's
associated with
what
the
that book
English
is.
meaning that we kinda think of. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
and we'll get into the whole revealing, unveiling, kind of theme or motif in the book of Revelation, but then obviously in all of these sort of apocalyptic examples as well.
Well, and but I also the only reason I brought all that up though is this is mostly going to be talking about like end of the world stuff, right? Like that's
Well,
the
that's
impression I
yeah,
have is
because like
that
you
like
said, the
when you
pop
say
culture examples.
apocalypse, you're using the pop culture common coinage end of the world.
Mhm.
We're talking about the end of days when we talk about this.
Well, but also what I wanna do is to, even in those examples where they're not as clear or as obvious that there is an unveiling taking place, is there an unveiling? Even though they're not trying to do it in the same way that St. John was in the book of Revelation.
Wait a second. Are you saying that these two concepts are not mutually exclusive, Mike?
Something like that, yeah. It's almost like that's what we're trying to
Whoa.
do in every episode, isn't it?
We're about to blow your mind,
Yep,
audience.
exactly. It's about
Just you
time.
wait.
So before we go any further though, I do want to back up and do a very, very brief review of Rene Girard and Mimetic Desire and the Scapegoat, because that's actually going to play a role into some of the stuff that we're going to be going through in a lot of these kind of apocalyptic sort of movies. So just really quickly, Rene Girard, he was he actually, I think he was originally studying literature, but then did a lot of like anthropology, sociology. He was a professor at Stanford for a number of years. He was originally baptized Catholic, fell away from the faith, but it was actually from this sort of discovery that he noticed in literature that, in a sense, gave him a new appreciation and understanding of Jesus, and which is then what eventually brought him back to the Catholic faith before he died. But it was this idea of, when you see in all these different myths, all these different cultures, that there is this sort of mechanism where you'll have this conflict between two groups, and it's usually over some third thing, and how the desire, and he called it mimetic desire, mime, like miming, you're copying something, is
Mhm.
you'll have party B is miming, or their desire is conditioned by party A, and party A's original desire for that thing. And so that's where this conflict comes up, because then you create this sort of scenario where it's like, it's almost like a keeping up with the Joneses. And this tension builds, and there has to be some release to this tension between this conflict. And this is where the scapegoat comes in, where both of them unite together. And it doesn't have to be just two literal people. It could be, two groups of people or a bunch of people in a community, but they all have to find some outlet for this tension, and that
Mhm.
outlet becomes the scapegoat, and the scapegoat is the one who, in a sense, receives the bears the burden of this tension of the community. And that can sometimes be through like ostracization or even violence. Oftentimes it was violence, and
Mhm.
that would, in a sense, bring bring the community back to kind of like a functional level until the
Yeah.
next tension
The
started to build,
enemy
and
of
then they
my
had to find,
enemy yeah, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In other
and then the
words,
cycle
like, if
would
you can
start over.
find a mutual enemy,
Yeah.
then two people who were once enemies could be friends against the common enemy,
Mm.
and, that's kinda scapegoat in a nutshell, right? At least in the
And
Gerardian sense.
the actual term scapegoat is one that comes from the book of Leviticus, where when the Israelites are getting this, and I almost said Genesis because when we were talking in our scapegoat episodes, go back to what are those, like episodes 5 and 6 or something, but
Mhm.
in our scapegoat episodes, I was talking about how even though the law itself, the actual like standardized function where Israel would do this, they would take two goats into the temple. One would be the one that's sacrificed in the temple. The other one, the priest would lay his hands on, and then it would be chased out of town into the desert, which was the
Yep.
scapegoat.
Yep.
I was saying Genesis because I saw that there was a sort of foreshadowing of this practice in the two sons of Abraham, where you have Isaac, the one who was brought and offered at the top of Mount Moriah, and then you had Ishmael, who was the one who, in a sense, took
Was
on the
driven
weight
off.
of Abraham's. Yeah, Ishmael and Hagar took on the weight of Abraham's disobedience. Because again, Ishmael is the result of Abraham not obeying God's original plan of having a son through Sarah.
Mhm.
And so they had to take the weight of that sin, and they were sent out of the community into the desert. And so Ishmael was the original scapegoat. But then why I brought that up is, what's the title of that episode, Jacob? Do you remember? Who's the ultimate greatest of all time? The scapegoat
That's
is
true.
Jesus,
Is
because he
Jesus.
takes both of those. He unites both of them. The one that dies on the altar or on the mountain, right? He's raised
Mhm.
up on the cross. But before he was raised on the cross, he was chased out of the city. He had to die outside the walls. And he carried the weight of the sins on the cross. So he became the scapegoat too. So he was
Well,
the scapegoat and
uh
the Paschal lamb.
And so when you think about the reasoning, the rationale for sending the goat that carries the burdens, carries the sins out into the wilderness, out into the desert, outside the walls of the city, right? What you're
Mhm,
describing is sending sin back from whence it came. What you're
mhm.
describing is sending sin back to its natural habitat, which is the chaos outside of civilization. In
Or the
other
death
words,
of the desert. Yeah.
well, and the desert does equal death, but the desert equals death because chaos equals death, right? The
Mhm,
desert is the uncivilized, the uncultured, the wilderness, the red in tooth and claw place that's not
mhm,
habitable by man, right? So that's the whole symbolism behind sending the goat out. When you apply it to Jesus being sent outside the walls of Jerusalem, the city of peace, right? He gets sent out into the
mhm,
desert, and where he gets out in the desert to die, right? Like you just said.
mhm,
But more than that, he gets sent out into the desert to go down into hell. He gets
mhm.
sent out in the desert, like death is the
Yeah.
passage, the door that brings him to the true desert, right? The real desert, which is Hades,
Yep.
where he's going to go and he's going to redeem all that and he's going to civilize it. He's going to break down those shackles and end that slavery, and he's going to constitute a new kingdom of heaven. And that's going to be a city, right? It's going to
Mhm.
be, as
Again,
the book of
civilization.
Revelation,
Yep, return to
right?
civilization.
And so that's I just wanted to kind of walk through the symbolism of all that because I think that it's it's pertinent, and I think it'll probably come up in this conversation too. But
It better, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
hope so. Or
so
else that was a big
so
waste of all your
yeah.
time.
Now, the other reason why Rene Girard is actually important as sort of an introduction is one of his colleagues at Stanford, who was also in this kind of field of sociology, but it did a little, but worked in philosophy and theology as well. Is Jean-Pierre Dupuy. It's
Okay.
Dupuy, and he has a sort of, it's almost like an extension of Rene Girard's mimetic desire and scapegoat, but he was looking at it as more of a like on an even wider level, and it has to do with the idea of apocalypse and end of the world. And the theory is called enlightened doomsaying. And what that's
Enlightened
referring to,
doomsaying.
yeah,
I mean,
S A Y I N G,
that's a pretty clickbaity
yeah,
title for your
a little bit,
academic thesis, you know what I mean?
yeah. Well, that's, you know what you got.
He was
That's what you
ahead
got
of
to
his
do
time. He
nowadays.
was ahead of his time. I'm not knocking him. I'm
No,
interested. Tell me
there's
more, Professor Dupoy.
so then there's, it's actually funny, there's become kind of a joke in a lot of academic writing where the people who, because that's the only way you can get yourself published in journals, is you have to either have like you said, a clickbait title, or a reference to pop culture, or a reference to pop
Uh,
culture has to be in your title, or you're not going to get, like, they're not going to get published because nobody will read it then.
you
But
know what? Who
so
says the internet not ruining culture, right?
yeah,
Another point in
ruining,
case, folks.
hey, this is
Wait a second.
this is what we're doing, Jacob.
I
So
prefer my
enlighten,
academic papers to include pop culture references and clickbait
yeah.
titles.
So,
Fair enough.
so
Fair
what it
enough. I get
is
it.
really quickly is, and these are the words of Dupuy in, because, and he wrote a book about it, and I can't remember the title off the top of my head right now. But anyway, enlightened doomsaying. So philosophical attitude, metaphysical challenge to our usual way of thinking about the world and the time that is based on peculiar temporality of catastrophe. Now, I really tried.
I just realized that my entire life is one nonstop litany of what I consider enlightened doomsaying. So maybe I
Okay,
need to like really dig into this Dupoy guy and
maybe,
find
yeah.
out, get a little insight in my own psyche. But
In
okay. Sorry to
in
interrupt.
the show notes, I actually included an article of uh, a recent politician who's actually making reference to this. It's
Really?
in California, which kind of makes sense because that's where Stanford is. But anyway,
We have show
it comes
notes?
from, yeah, I know. I'll
Okay.
read them to you sometimes. How's that sound? I'll read them to you. So, he was inspired by this, by the implementation of, and the, you could almost say, the non-use of nuclear weapons, because first what he would say is that he would kind of compare the dropping of the atomic bomb, as that was kind of like the original sacrifice, the original scapegoat sacrifice. But then since then, because there was this arms race that happened during the Cold War, the ironic thing that he kind of pointed out was that everybody was so worried about the end of the world because of
Yep.
this accumulation of nuclear arms, that we now have, all this power to destroy everything. But it was the very fact that you had these two sides that had the power that caused this Cold War, where one wasn't going to use it on the other because of the retaliation factor, and so then neither side ends up using it, and that in a sense becomes this like tension that was, like, in a sense, preventing
They
the
had a name for that,
apocalypse.
Mike. Surely you
Okay.
know. You've never heard this? You
The
learned this in high
so
school.
the destruction thing, the
Yeah.
what's it called?
Uh,
What is it called
what?
now?
Me worry? Mutual assured destruction.
That's what it is. Mutually
Yeah,
assured
man.
destruction. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, mutual assured destruction. Nuclear deterrence.
Yep.
Good
Yeah.
old nuclear deterrence. It works until it doesn't, folks. It works
Yeah.
until it doesn't.
And so now you can start to see the connection that this is going to have to the apocalypse and the end of the world, right? But how this Professor Dupois was inspired by his colleague Girard and his kind of scapegoat mechanism, scapegoat theory.
That's interesting,
But
yeah.
anyway, let's get into the stories, Jacob, because I feel like I'm boring everybody with all this teaching stuff.
Okay. We want to talk about the pop culture references to the apocalypse, right? Is that what you're asking me to
We
do?
could jump into that, or we could do some of the ancient, like, mythological ends of the world, ancient mythological. We can kind of jump back and
You know,
forth
do a little
because
Chronos.
it's, we could do, yeah, I've got
Start at the beginning.
Ragnarok. Yeah, or,
All right,
either way.
Ragnarok. Because one thing we don't do enough on this podcast is talk about Vikings, right? I've
Uh-huh.
often thought that we need to.
You say that about
I
every podcast.
personally,
There's like
I
a
need,
soccer
I
podcast, and you're like, you know what they really need to bring in here is we need
reminds
to
me
talk
of
about some
Odin.
Odin. Yeah.
Yeah. um. Yeah. No, I was just calling myself out. I feel like I'm always just bringing Vikings up.
That's me
Because I
throwing you a
grew up in
bone.
Minnesota, yeah. But yeah, Ragnarok. That's because it's the most famous apocalypse, right, in mythology, hands down. I
Mhm.
mean, everyone knows Ragnarok has somehow. Well, maybe because there was a Thor movie called Ragnarok, but like,
Mhm.
I feel like even before, like they named it Ragnarok because people would recognize the word Ragnarok and they
Mhm.
recognize, oh, that's like the Viking apocalypse, right?
Yep.
Um, and it's a particularly nasty apocalypse, let me tell you. No one gets out alive in
Mhm.
Ragnarok,
It's the
including the
twilight of the
gods.
gods. Yeah.
Yep. And so it's a very kind of nihilistic, death of everything. There are some people who think that there might be hints of there being like a renewal, a rebirth, and all that. Um, but even the fact that it's just like hints of it kind of implies that, or I can't remember. Is it that like
Well,
Christians kind of mapped onto
Well, I
it
was gonna say
after the
because
fact?
this is one of the things that always comes up with the Norse mythology is that we don't have, quote unquote true Norse mythology. We only have the Christianized version of it, in which
Hmm.
case it would make sense that there is a sort of resurrection at the after the death of the gods, like you were saying, or the death of everything,
Right.
like Ragnarok sort of is. So it that's why it would make sense for either people to read into it or for there to actually be something there.
Sure.
But
I mean, it's a pretty metal story though, you know. You
yeah.
got Loki. Loki's been chained up for a long time, the god of mischief, the trickster
Mm.
god. And
The strong
he
man has been bound, yeah.
he but he gets released and then he rises up with all the giants, the evil giant people,
Mhm.
they basically represent like forces of nature and things like that.
Yeah.
Um and
Just like the
and then
Titans in Greek mythology. You mentioned
yeah, they
Kronos,
are.
so it's like
Yeah,
it's
for sure.
basically the parallel to that.
It
But yeah,
is.
as you were saying.
But they're also considered bad guys, right? That kind of goes back to, and it's not true because there's lots of like intermarriage and things like that too. But like it does kind of go
Mm.
back to the idea that like nature is the uninhabitable realm of death and destruction, right?
It's
That we
not
were
the
talking about at the
mother,
beginning of this.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's not the
Um,
nurturing mother. It's wild.
well, right. I mean, it could be. So that's why we're a garden. That's why we're gardeners, Mike. We got to
Well, now
tame
you're
the
now you're
nature.
Christianizing you're Christianizing my
Yeah.
mythology,
No,
Jacob,
you're
so that's
right.
why.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying, but
Dang Christians always Christianizing everything.
yeah, deal with
But
it. That's what I say. I
that's
said
what I
deal with
yeah,
it.
it's like
Yeah, we're gonna redeem all of
we're
it.
gonna make your culture appropriate.
Yep.
But so but you got Fenrir, the wolf, and let's see here. He gets into a big fight with Thor, right? And then ultimately
Mhm.
he kills Thor. They kill each other. I think they kill each other. But I
Yeah.
but Thor also is the person that
It's
kills
mutually assured destruction.
it is.
There's
Whoa,
your
what a
yeah,
callback.
look at that, exactly.
The big snake that wraps itself around the worlds. I think
Jormungandr, yeah,
but doesn't Thor kill the snake too? Yeah, it's been too long since I looked into this. But everyone
yeah.
dies. It doesn't matter because they all die in the
I
end
was gonna
anyway,
say, yeah,
right?
somebody
Spoiler
kills
alert,
somebody.
everybody dies.
Well, and we actually, in our death episode, which this will be coming out after the death episode, we talked about the relationship between Fenrir, Loki, Jormungandr, and Hel,
Mhm,
the goddess of death in Norse mythology. And so even just as you're mentioning the names, you can start to see how these relationships kind of play out too.
right. Yeah, so Ragnarok's a good one. Go, read a story about Ragnarok, it's fun. I mean, it's
There's
kind of a downer, but it's fun.
which I mean, it's yeah, it's the twilight, it's the darkening of it. It kind of has those sort of, I guess if this is more, since you wanted to bring in some modern examples, it's got a lot of those the long night vibes, like
Mhm.
Game of
Well,
Thrones.
I
Check
do
that
think
off your bingo card.
yeah, exactly, right. I do think that in, like, 21st century, kinda atheistic, scientific materialist, heat death of the universe philosophy,
Mhm.
there's something very sympathetic
There's a
to
lot of
Nordic
resonance
mythology.
too.
There's a lot of resonance,
Yeah.
So if you read somebody
Oh
like
yeah.
C.S. Lewis and he talks about how like before his Christian conversion, he was like super into like Ragnarok and um the northern gods of Europe and he thought that it was like beautiful, and there's a lot of there's something beautiful about tragedy, right? There's something we're super drawn
Mm,
to about the end of all good things, and the bittersweetness, and life is worth living because we know it's going to end, and things like that.
mm,
Which, as Christians, I think that we can still actually totally own all that too. At the end of the
mhm,
day, the new heavens and new earth aren't going to be identical to this. If you
mhm.
think that heaven and earth are going to be like a really, really cushy version of what your life is right now, that's probably inaccurate. And
That's the good place, and we know, I mean, the good place
yeah,
is turns out not to be the good place if you want another pop culture reference.
well,
I
there's a
mean,
Twilight Zone episode, Twilight of the Gods, right? There's a
oh,
Twilight Zone
yeah,
episode where a person, quote unquote, goes to heaven and
a nice
just gets
place to
everything he
visit. It's
wants.
my
Yeah,
favorite one.
yeah.
I show that to my
And
students every year. Yeah,
at the end of the
'cause
episode, the guy that's his caretaker is like, "Who said this was heaven?"
dun,
Like,
dun,
dun
dun.
dun
Yeah,
twist. But
yeah.
yeah, and so yeah, I'm bittersweet about this life. Like
Mm,
there's things about this life that I absolutely love, and I recognize that they're going to be here for a time, and that time is there for us, and we should love it. We absolutely should love it, but it's not. In all likelihood, it's not eternal. So
mm,
we'll find out when we get there. I mean, who really knows
yeah.
to some extent, but
Eye
I'm not
hasn't
banking
seen,
on it.
eye has not seen, ear has not heard. That's just, I've
Mhm.
something that's comes to mind. Um, there's a
Oh, is that a
so you
Plato
can maybe
quote?
help me with this one. Yeah, maybe something like that. There's a Taoist text that talks about the return of a messianic figure who will take the
Hmm.
faithful, the divine incantations. Are you familiar with
I
that or?
actually am not. That's interesting. I do like Taoism a lot and have some familiarity with it. It's got an interesting history. So
Mm,
over time, like the Taoism of Lao Tzu or Lao Tzu, however you want to pronounce his name, it 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 accrued. It
mhm,
accrued of religious traditions and rituals, and it kind of turned into a religion as such, right?
yeah.
Whereas much like Buddhism, it really is more of a philosophy of
Are
life.
you saying, oh, I thought you were gonna say the Taoists were all like, "It's not a religion, it's a relationship." Is that that would've been the, like,
That's what they would have said, yes. That
yeah.
is what they would have said. And hey,
Groan,
again, as
eye
again,
roll. Yeah.
the Christianity is a way to go back to our Mandalorian episodes. It's not about the rituals are valuable and God given. So I'm not, it's not a
Oh,
false
of course.
dichotomy, but some people will make it a false dichotomy in other religions.
Mhm.
Well, for both Christianity, yeah, like you said, it's a relationship, not a religion,
Yeah.
man. But like,
Yeah.
but also like you'll get people who say, "Oh, Buddhism was better when it was just like a philosophy, a way of life, way of dealing with like existential angst." And then it got ruined by all these like religious practices across the centuries or whatever. And the same would be true of Taoism, right? And it's like those
Mm.
things don't. You don't understand what those
Yeah.
rituals are doing.
It's
You
like,
know what I mean?
where do you think those came from, you know?
Yeah.
It's like, you having a problem with them, you're the aberration. You're the historical
Hmm.
aberration to say that we don't like it.
I mean, is it
So,
true that Lao Tzu probably would have thought it was weird that his teachings turned into a bunch of like religious ritual practices? Yeah, probably. But again, at the same time, when you step back at it at like the 1,000-mile level, that's all just natural too, Lao Tzu.
yep.
That's all just going with the flow too, bro. That's
Yeah.
what humans do, buddy.
Well, that it kind of brings me back to, again, we keep referring to like old concepts or episodes, which I guess is fine. That's what you do at the end of the year, right? Is you take stock of, the
Shall
entire year.
old episodes
Um,
be forgot and never brought to mind,
yeah,
Mike?
but it reminds me of, one of the things that I keep saying about the hero's journey is that, yeah, we have this book by Joseph Campbell, which was written in like the 70s, I think it was, or something like that. But no, it had to have been before. I think it was like 50s. But anyway, it's not like he was trying to convince us that he had just come up with this. He was
Mhm.
recognizing what had already been there. And that tells us that it comes from something within our human nature. But if you take that a step further and you say, well, why is it a part of our human nature? Well, we're made in the image and likeness of God, at least from a Christian standpoint. And so, if we are doing this as a part of our human nature because we're made in God's image and likeness, then there's something about this, quote unquote hero's journey, this departure, this initiation, and this return, or you could say this back and forth, this exchange of love between persons that has been there for all eternity. Now, we just happen to have a name for it called the Trinity. right? And the filioque. No, I'm just kidding. Not the
Yeah, I
filioque,
was about
Jacob.
to
Sorry,
say
I didn't mean to ruffle your
even
feathers.
even your my feathers are already ruffled, but I was going to politely
Yeah,
not say anything. So
but
go on, Mike, you
Mm,
Catholic,
no,
you
but
papist.
this idea, I was just trying to talk about the exchange of love, but in the Trinity, and how this is actually what the hero's journey is meant to ultimately be modeled after, is this emanation and this return, as Plotinus, the Neoplatonist philosopher, would say, or as this departure, initiation, and return that we see in all of the stories, including the story of Jesus.
Mhm.
But let's go into the apocalypse. We're starting to sound like this is going to be a 3-hour long episode, like we need three halves to it.
Are we
As
going back to the old two-parters of yesteryear?
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
but apocalypse in the Bible. So that's our, our quote unquote Christian mythology. What are some apocalypse stories in the Bible? Like, what's the first one?
oh, well, honestly, you might well, actually, no, the flood came first, didn't it? I was about to say, what about the Tower of Babel? But then I was like, oh, no. Yeah, so the flood, right?
Yeah, I mean, so that's
The
the
Great
classic, like,
Resets.
oh,
Too.
nice. That's a good
Yeah, yeah,
topical.
that's
Yeah.
topical. Um,
So yeah, we have this flood, which, as we've already talked about, and I've been bugging Jacob, just to pull you guys behind the veil. I've been bugging him about doing a water episode, and so I've been thinking about water a lot, as well as this end of the world
that's
thing.
why
The
you're
flood
going
is
to the
kind of the
bathroom so much these days, right, Mike?
well, as you get older. Well, you should know that, Jacob. You're much older than me, so
I just keep myself really dehydrated all the time. That's how I fix
yeah,
that
perfect.
problem.
So we have, yeah, I mean, and obviously we're not going to get through necessarily all of them, but definitely the flood is like that standard of, Christian end of the world stories that came
Mhm.
at the beginning, so to speak, at the beginning. And then there's the reset. But a big one, and this is really important for the month of November and the end of the liturgical year, is the destruction of the temple.
Yeah.
So we have, oftentimes you'll have people who are trying to, like, again, sort of have the hot take about Jesus and Christianity, when they'll say things like, well, Jesus didn't, or the Christians didn't, they thought that Jesus was going to come back in their lifetime because look at these prophecies or look at these predictions. And
Right.
so Jesus must have been wrong, or he must not have known what he was talking about. And it's like, you're imposing your own
Mhm.
modernist, like, secular view, when what if the end of the world that he was talking about, because to a Israelite person, the end of the world would have meant, or the destruction of the temple would have meant the end of the world. And
Yeah.
we saw that happen with the Babylonian destruction of the temple, when they overran and took Israel captive in the Old Testament. But then we see it happen again in 70 AD by the Romans.
Yep.
And that's the one that Jesus, of course, was talking about.
Well, and it
And
really is. It genuinely is an end of the established order. And in which
yeah,
case, historically speaking, it literally did. I mean, Judaism
mhm.
was never the same after that, right?
Judaism
Um,
had to completely rethink itself. Like,
reconstitute itself. Yeah.
yeah.
It's the end of an established order. This is why the Romans, you talk about like the fall of the Roman Empire, right? It's the end of an established order. When historians refer to like the Dark Ages following, it's
Mhm.
obviously that's kind of a misnomer, but what it's getting at is the fact that like it was like the twilight of civilization,
Well,
when
it
Rome fell,
it's
quote
it's
unquote.
appropriately named if you're talking about the right time period. The misnomer part is that people use it to refer to the Middle Ages, to the medieval times, when really it should be talking about, yeah, 476 to about 800, maybe 900.
It's certainly
That's
a time of
when,
cataclysm, a time of
yeah,
the destruction of cultural order and civilization and things like that, right?
you've been thinking
Um,
about the Roman Empire lately, haven't you?
it's
Oh,
true.
that's the meme. I don't know. That's
I've noticed. I
You've noticed
we
the
won't get
meme.
off track. Yeah, but that's like
Yeah.
what's up with that anyway. Um,
Yeah.
you take it away, Mike. Where were we?
Okay.
I don't even.
So,
I don't. I've lost
well,
my train of thought. I have no idea.
that's okay. So, well, why I brought, so yeah, the flood is our big kind of Old Testament one. Then we have another Old Testament example of the first time the temple was destroyed. But why that's so important is because it takes us to the one that Jesus was talking about, but also the one that our book of Revelation, da 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 da, was
Mhm.
talking about. So you were just saying how it was this cataclysmic event. It was this reconstituting of basically all of reality for a Jewish person, which again, the first Christians all would have seen themselves in light of their Judaism too. So this
For sure.
destruction of the temple was just as cataclysmic. Now, in a sense, they had the temple of Jesus's body, right? So they already had a new temple that had been destroyed and was raised up again, to quote
Well,
the Gospel of
yeah,
John.
and this is it's saying the same thing. Christians
Yeah.
were okay with living in the end times. Like they
Mhm.
were, and we're saying for like 2,000 years. The end times doesn't mean it's going to end
Well,
in
St.
30
Peter
years.
referred to us as the end times back in
Yeah,
Pentecost.
we
So the end times
are
have been going on for 2,000 years.
reconstituting the world. Like
Mhm.
the Christian life is an apocalypse. It is an end of the old and an in with the new type experience, right?
Mhm.
It's apocalyptic by nature, and that we toyed with that being both like a state of revelation, but also a state of end. The end of something, right? Those two kind of common themes. And Christianity is truly both, and it's so the Book of Revelation itself. My understanding of the Book of Revelation personally is that it's both a description of the final end time, something
Mhm.
approximating Ragnarok, right? The actual end of days type stuff. But
Mhm.
it's also something that is prophetic, to go back to how we treat prophecy in our prophecy episodes. It tells you something about the truth of reality. And so
Mhm.
Christians believe that reality is cyclical. Of course, it's also spiraling upward, right? So it's a
Mhm.
cycle that is
Yep.
moving in a direction, right? But that cycle is still there, and so
Yeah.
the rise and fall of time, and the end of things, the rebirth of things, I think is very much it's in our
So it's
liturgical calendar, for crying out
It's
loud.
so it's so great that you actually mentioned the cyclical, but also the spiral, because if you go to a lot of, Bible studies or commentaries on the Book of Revelation, they will show that exact picture of that's how the Book of Revelation itself was modeled,
Oh
is you
yeah,
have this it's a cycle, but it's not just a cycle that stays in place and does the same thing over and over, but it's a cycle that's also moving forward. And that's
interesting.
actually the writing style that, again, if we're going to take John the apostle as the author, right, which just traditionally that's the case. um if you that's exactly the structure that the book is in. So it's fitting that that's what it's also describing, because
Sure.
that's how it's written. But yeah, no,
Oh,
to go to
yeah, this is everywhere in
you
Christianity.
stumble
So
upon these great points, Jacob, without even realizing it.
it's just what
How
I
how
do,
nice for
man.
you.
It's just
How
what I
nice for
do.
you to just be able to just
You
wake up,
know,
rub your eyes, and then you can just say all these
Lao
profound
Tzu
things, whereas
say, Lao
I'm
Tzu
over here in
say
the
that if
corner
you
with my
don't try,
books.
if
Yeah.
you don't try, well, oh man, if only I had a pithy Taoist saying now, the
Oh,
empty
see,
bowl gets filled.
it doesn't work
Uh,
100% of the time, I guess. So,
yeah.
as you've already mentioned, and yeah, I think it's one of the most important things to highlight is, people will make such a big deal about, oh, these are the end of times or these are the last days. And as you said, every Christian should be like, yeah, that's been the case for 2,000 years. That's exactly what St. Peter said on the
Hmm.
birthday of the church. If Pentecost is like the informal birthday of the church, that's exactly what St. Peter said. Is we've been in the end times. So what
Dude,
else is
I
new?
I I was teaching a Sunday school class once where it was the Sunday of Judgment within the
Mhm.
Orthodox tradition, and I was
Matthew
like, "Who here
25, is
thinks?"
that
I can't remember
do you
what
read Matthew
what
25?
actual gospel we read on it. It
Because
very
I
well might
sorry to
have been,
interrupt,
but
but just to say, that is the one we read on the last Sunday of the church year is Matthew 25. So that's again, it's got this end of the year, end of the world, judgment, theme going on.
Okay.
But anyway.
Well, so but I asked everyone in class, I was like, so we're going over like the icon of the Last Judgment and things like talking about the Last Judgment. And I was like, who here thinks you're going to be alive to see the Last Judgment? Who here thinks that you're going to see the end of the world in your lifetime and things like that? And like no one raises their hand, because it's just not that
Mhm.
type of denomination, but some denominations,
Yeah.
everyone would be raising their hands. But uh, I was like, see, but you're all going to die, and you're all gonna see the
It's
final judgment.
well,
And
yeah,
so
we all
everyone's life, outside of my little gotcha moment with like children, right? It's the only type of
Mhm.
gotcha I can get is, but is we all of our lives are meant to be an apocalypse, and all of our lives are meant to be are the end of the world, right? Your
Mhm. Every
experience
time
of
you die,
reality
it's the end
itself,
of the
it's
world
the end of the
as you
world
know
for
it.
some. Yeah, nice.
As uh
Yeah,
How
you
you
feel
feeling?
fine. You feeling fine with
Yeah.
that one, Mike?
Yep.
Uh,
I'm feeling strong. To quote another end of the world movie, end of the
This is
world
the most
quote.
self-referential episode we've ever done, like, hands
That's
down.
podcasting for you.
Yeah, no, we're running out of ideas.
That's peak podcasting is what that is.
No one will enjoy this episode unless they've watched all 50 hours of what's
Except
come
for
before.
us. Except for us.
I'm
Hey,
doing
it's
it,
a worthy
yeah.
investment. It's a worthwhile investment.
Hey, go
trust
out
me.
there and buy some T-shirts or something.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, you
yeah,
got your ad in
because
for
they're not the Voyage comics. My overlords aren't getting anything out of this. It's all for me, baby. So I might as well tell
Yeah.
you guys to go buy some books or something. There
Hey,
you go.
is
You
there
happy?
Is there an apocalyptic book that Voyage makes, Jacob? A comic book?
Whoa, yeah, absolutely. I think it
Atlantis?
was called the Leibowitz option or something like that. No, I'm just kidding.
What? No.
No, I
It's
know.
an Atlantis comic.
No, I thought
I
you were talking
set you
about no.
up perfect.
I thought you were talking about Lord of the World.
Oh, that's a good. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That is one. Yeah.
See who's silly now, Mike. I was just making a reference to the Canticle for Leibowitz. That was too meta. Honestly, that joke was too. It was too many cooks in the kitchen with that.
So
one.
actually, there's a Jonah comic where it brings in a lot of this Atlantis motifs, which again, that's a flood story. That's an end of the world story. That's an apocalypse story.
True.
And then you've also got the Voyage classics, Lord of the World, as you were saying, which is a great apocalypse novel it's written by a priest, written in a very Christian way or from a Christian perspective. It's not trying to like retell or give you like a certain version. It's not a Left Behind book by any means. But
way to kick them while they're down, Mike.
Oh, they're down? You mean the
I don't know, maybe
franchise
not.
that has sold like 50 million copies are down?
It's pretty good. I don't think I ever actually finished it, but back when I was a Protestant, I read through a lot of those. It's pretty good. Pretty good. Go read it, kids. You'll like it. I mean, it's probably not very Catholic or Orthodox, but it's a rip-roaring adventure through the end of the world, and Jesus is the hero at the end. So
watch the Nicolas Cage movie instead. Did you know that they?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, there's a few. There's a few movies.
Well,
now.
that's funny though. Is Nick Cage was in the Left Behind movie, but he was also in another End of the World movie. Do you remember Knowing?
I do. I don't think I ever actually saw that one though. I know which one you're talking about.
That one's very much.
That's based off a Philip K. Dick movie, I think,
of course,
or book
or short story. Yeah,
short story.
I mean, that's what that doesn't surprise me because he has a lot of really good ones.
Yeah, they've been robbing Philip K. Dick's grave for years, Hollywood.
Yeah. Well, and they've also haven't always been doing like justice to it because some of them are kind of campy, but and the Nick Cage movie didn't get like. It was fine. It
didn't revolutionize cinema.
Revolutionize cinema.
Whoa,
Jacob.
I like it.
Okay, so we actually had a good example, which we haven't even. We wanted to get to a really good example, which fits with our theme of apocalypse. Jacob, do you want to share that one with our audience?
Wait, are you? See, you want me to talk about apocalypto?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are we not going to do that?
No, we could. I think that this apocalypto should be something that we talk about like more at length. But apocalypse.
Would you care to run through the plot for us?
It's about a guy who runs the entire time. The ends, and then the conquistadors show up,
and then that's the unveiling, though. I know that's what makes it so
there's
good.
There's meaty themes in this movie, and I feel
that's why you want to save it.
There can be like a better conversation.
Okay, all right. Let's save the full length apocalypto talk. All I want to do is one of the big scenes, it's one of the the scenes that stands out.
Yes, I'll give you. Okay, so here, all right. Now I'm on the same page with you. I remember this now. So one of the themes of this episode is we haven't done a good job, in my opinion.
No. I think this has been great. I think this has been a fun conversation.
A fun episode. But is the idea that remember how we were talking about Gerard a long time ago,
scapegoating and sacrifice
and stuff.
I still remember. That's why I'm trying to get us here.
So basically, the notion is that the sacrifice, the scapegoat, is what postpones or cancels the apocalypse. To quote a really great movie, Pacific Rim, that evidently Mike has not even seen. What is wrong with you? How have you not seen that movie? All right, it's
Just
a good movie.
just
Fix
keep
yourself.
moving. Just move
Yeah.
on. Okay.
But
I'll find what streaming service it's on. We'll
yeah.
have a chat about it afterwards. So you
Who is
got your
that
Pacific
super?
Rim reference in.
Yeah,
So
we're
or what's
canceling
the
the apocalypse.
Del
What's his
Toro,
face?
right?
No,
Or
well, that's
who?
the director. It's the really
Yeah,
cool black guy. Really, everyone loves this dude. He's so
this is
cool.
great. Yeah,
That
this is
guy.
so good.
He's not. His name's not coming to me. I can't think of his name, but
Thank goodness. Thank goodness
They
you
want him to
edit
be James
these and you
Bond.
have the humility. Idris Elba. Idris
Idris
Elba.
Elba. There you
Oh,
go.
okay.
See,
All right.
he's the main character in that movie, and he goes, "We're canceling the apocalypse," and it's a great moment. So anyway, back to
Apocalypto.
Apocalypto. The
Where's
idea
is there
is that
sacrifice by the? Yeah, go
in
ahead.
fact there is. In fact there is. That's right. Hey, you know what? So spoiler alert, Mike, since you're the only person in the world who hasn't seen this movie, is that
That's so not true. You know that's not true. There's
for a spoiler alert from Mike, at the end of the movie, there ultimately has to be a sacrificial, like destruction, in order to stop the apocalypse. Like
Mhm,
because the aliens are coming up and they're going to invade this reality, and basically someone has to volunteer to like set off a nuke at the fissure that the aliens are coming through. And so there's this big question of like self-sacrifice at the end. But yes, how they cancel the apocalypse in that movie is through an act of self-sacrifice. And so there you go. And if you
mhm.
want to bring that back to Aztec or Mayan civilization, what is it? Aztec?
It
The
was
Aztec?
Mayan. It was Mayan, I
Is it
think.
Mayan?
Yeah.
Um, the in the movie Apocalypto, there's this really, really climactic moment in the true English
It's
history class.
climactic. They go up the top too. So it's like
There's everything you
it's
learned in high
symbolic.
school about like climax and literary theory is very, very on the nose in this movie.
Yep.
But so these villages are enslaved by the Mayan Empire, I guess. And so half the movie is being brought to the capital of the Mayans for human sacrifice. And then the hero of the story manages to escape that doom, and the rest of the movie is the denouement of that and them trying to get him back. And ironically, they don't. And because they don't cancel the apocalypse because the sacrifice
Because
didn't
what's
take
the
place.
yep.
and
So
and then the
the
movie
end of
ends with the
the
conquistadors showing up, and it's like, oh,
yeah.
you guys are done.
It is.
um
So I mean, it's obviously got that historical element, but as we have, I mean, like you said, we got to do a full episode on Apocalypto because it is so mythical. It's mythological. I mean, think of like the whole panther kind of scene or the whole chase, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's a hero's, it's a hero's run, it's a hero's journey, but and it's an escape one. It's so like I
it was a
mean,
good
it's really
movie.
good. But
Yeah.
what we wanted to highlight especially is, like you said, there's the sacrifice, and you get the sense of, and what's great about this too is that none of it is in English. So you have to like infer a lot of things just by looks of the characters too. And
Sure.
you get this, that like the people in power, like, oh, they're the ones who kind of know how things really work and they're using it to their advantage. But really effectively it's the same from the people's perspective. That is still the thing that is keeping them alive or keeping them in power. And then yeah, ultimately, like you said, the sacrifice doesn't happen, and we know the consequences because we see the ship show up, and we also know history. But
You know what just hit me? Last of Us. The Last
oh
of Us.
yeah,
She doesn't
I
get
would
sacrificed, and because she doesn't get sacrificed, the cure to the cordyceps zombie
so
apocalypse doesn't happen.
Jacob,
So,
as I was making this, I was literally thinking, is this save the whole world and lose your soul? Because
mhm.
that's what Knock at the Cabin is. That's actually what our next
Okay,
example is
yeah.
going to be.
Tell me about Knock at the
That's
Cabin, because I haven't
so
seen this movie yet. I got pretty good reviews from what I understand.
it was just kind of those middle of the road ones. I mean,
Okay.
but anyway, yeah, I'm not going to give you such a hard time for not seeing this as you did about
Well,
Pacific
because
Rim,
that's
but
not Pacific
that's
Rim, bro.
okay. So,
Dun, 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 dun,
really
dun,
quick
dun.
before
Best
so one of
soundtrack
the other
ever, by the
things I
way.
wanted to mention is what's so significant about these end of the world types of scenes. Go back to our Judaism, and it's the temple that's destroyed in Apocalypto. It's where does this ultimately happen? It's on top of the temple,
Mhm.
and so there's something to be said about the sacrifice taking place, right? The connection between sacrifice and the end of the world. And
Uh-huh.
when we talk about what's actually being destroyed, when we talk about the destruction of the temple in the book of Revelation, that is the sacrifice. And what was the temple the house of? It was the house of God, which is why
Mm.
Jesus makes such a big deal about the temple of his body in John. That's the significance, because the temple becomes the sacrifice when he dies on the
Mm.
cross. And it also becomes the place of perpetual sacrifice, because where do we worship now? We don't just worship in the temple of these four walls, that has a
Mhm.
cross on top. It's the temple of Jesus's body, because the Eucharist is continually present at the
Yeah.
divine liturgy.
Yep, yep.
But moving on to Cabin in the Woods, you said how
Or no, that's
or
not
sorry,
Cabin in the Woods.
I know, Cabin. But that's the thing.
Knock
That's
at
the
the
joke about
Cabin,
the
right?
that's the joke about the whole cabin thing, though, right? Is like that's the horror movie trope. Is
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
but
for sure.
anyway, and actually you get the sort of sense that like these visitors have a kind of like zombie-ish, because that's like Night of the Living Dead, is they go to the cabin, right?
I see.
But anyway, they
Well,
don't act like
give a
zombies.
brief rundown, the basic premise of Knock
Yeah,
at the Cabin.
we only have 10 minutes left in the episode.
Well, no one's
So
gonna understand anything unless you don't tell
no,
them
no,
what this
no.
movie is.
So the premise is you have this family, and it's a daughter with two homosexual guys, two dads, and
Go
you
figure.
and now the thing is though is that
That's
that
brave. That was
actually
brave of those filmmakers.
yeah, in
Go on.
2016 I think, or whatever. 2000 No, it's early. It's like
It's not
2022.
no, yeah, it's like last year.
2023. No,
Yeah.
but actually it is pertinent to the story, because it does affect the back and forth between them, because the assumption is that they're being targeted because they're gay. So
Mm. So it actually
that
serves a
actually
purpose?
it contributes to the dynamic. Yes. They think that they're only here to like but I should back up a little bit. So you have this family, right? The two dads and the daughter who are on vacation at this cabin, and then you have this mysterious guy show up and talk to the daughter because she's out, like picking crickets and putting them in a jar.
Hmm.
And he says, "I need to go talk to your dad now. Can you go tell them?" And she runs back, and she was already scared by him. And
Because
because he is mysterious.
it's well, no, is it not,
It's Dave Bautista, yeah.
yeah,
So he's a
Dave
big
Bautista.
imposing
Because of
figure.
course, right? I mean, if
Yeah.
Dave Bautista shows up out of the woods at your cabin,
Yeah.
it's just like, I'd be scared too.
And he says, "I have some friends and we need to talk to your dads." So she runs back. She tells him, "Get inside. Don't let him in." And so they get in. The dads, of course, are skeptical. They're like, What's going on?" But then they hear this knock at the door, and she's like freaking out because, like I said, she's so scared. They eventually, kind of force their way in, and there's a little bit of a confrontation, some fight or whatever. But they then explain to them that they have had these visions, and in these visions, they see these catastrophic things happening, and that they've been told that there needs to be a sacrifice that will stop this, ultimately, the end of the world from happening. Now,
Okay.
the significance, Jacob, is guess how many of these visitors there are? There is one, two, three, four of them. Does that sound like anything that might resonate with the book of Revelation and Apocalypse?
Oh, I get
Yeah.
it.
And what happens too is what they say is that if they say no to the sacrifice, then then there's going to be this judgment, but the judgment happens after one of these four is killed. And they call that, like,
So,
that's when justice is being poured out, because remember how like the angel pours out the chalice or whatever, like that's God's
are they
that's when the
actually
thing happens.
so wait, so is the judgment actually like the 4 horsemen judgment? So, like, does one of the
Yep.
guys die and all of a sudden, like, a war breaks out in the Middle East or something? Like,
Yep. So they correspond to, like, one of them is plague. So like after one of them, they turn on the news and they can see that this huge virus has like killed a bunch of people and all that. Uh, so and I'm honestly I'm blanking on what the four horsemen are right now. It's like one is war, one is I think one is
famine,
just called
plague,
death.
death. Yeah. War,
Um,
famine,
is it
plague, death.
pestilence or something? Yeah. So anyway, they correspond to each of those, where one of these four visitors will then die, and then they turn on the news and they can see that, some, again, cataclysmic thing is going
Mhm.
on. And the two dads are like, "This is crazy. Like, of course we don't believe you. Of course we're not going to sacrifice one of us to do this. Like, why would we believe you?" And of course that's a big part of the movie, is this conversation, and
Well,
it'll
yeah, it
do like
sounds pretty
flashbacks.
interesting, honestly. Like, I'm kind of
It
intrigued.
No, it is, yeah. And but they'll show these flashbacks of their lives, and this sort of kind of paints a better picture for you because the one guy looks at one of them and says, "Hey, aren't you the guy that attacked me because I was, having dinner with my husband or whatever? Of course you're targeting us because that's who we are." Right? So that's part of it. That's why I said
Mm,
that's why it is actually relevant. Um
okay.
but they say, only a pure sacrifice will save the world, which you as the viewer is like, "Oh my gosh, are they going to kill the kid?" Like this is,
Yeah,
I can't
I
handle
would
this.
think so. Yeah.
But and so again, there's different points where like one of them tries to break free and like fight them, and there's different struggles that happen. That's not the most important part of it. But then the like the last example, Dave Batista is of course the last one, and he says, if this doesn't happen, then everything's going to go dark. The whole world is going to end, but you will be forced to walk this desolate earth by yourselves. And so, I mean, I don't know, do you want me to give you the ending or give it away or whatever? But
I don't know if it's worth it for the podcast. I'll sacrifice. Otherwise, the podcast will end, and
well,
then so the sacrifice must be made, right?
so yeah,
Wait, let me
exactly.
guess. Let me guess.
Okay.
They get into a giant mech, sink to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and detonate a nuclear bomb,
Towards
and
the
that
rim, would you say?
cancels the apocalypse.
That
Huh?
now detonating the nuclear bomb, is that the Bruce Willis one too? Were you doing
Oh,
that?
Armageddon. That's called
Yeah, was that
Armageddon. We never
Armageddon?
even brought up
Yeah.
Armageddon.
That's okay,
Ah,
that's okay.
he has to
Maybe you can
sacrifice
sing
himself at
maybe
the
you
end of
can
that
sing
one.
the Steven
I
Tyler
don't
song
wanna
at the end.
close my eye. Is this the new shtick? As every episode ends with me singing a classic rock song?
I mean, I didn't make you do it the first
Don't
time,
wanna
so
fall asleep 'cause I miss you,
but,
babe.
interestingly, so, the one dad does ultimately sacrifice the other, but it's like you get a sense of, like,
The
the
one
one's at
dead
peace with it.
sacrifices the other, huh?
Yeah, well, that's
Dang.
why I
So it
said,
wasn't okay.
but, there's other things that I've left out some details, like one of them, because in one of the struggles, the guy hits his head and he has this vision and he, like,
So
convinces him,
he
like, "No,
starts
this
to
does have to happen." So, the one of them does go like a lamb to the slaughter. So, one of them, in a sense, you could say he also sacrifices himself, right,
okay.
first. So that's sort of part of it. One of the big like one of the really like almost like giveaways that this is clearly what it was meant to be is the end of the movie, which we don't even see how this starts, but it's the survivor dad and the daughter, and they're leaving the cabin to get into the guy who came there, the visitor's car to drive away, and a fire has started. And so the whole thing is on fire. Like the entire cabin is now on fire. And it's like, "Oh, you mean like a sacrifice at the temple?" So it's like
I
it
see.
all, but it's also obviously got that end of the world sense of like it all ends in fire too.
Mhm.
So
Sure,
so the
sure.
movie itself ends in fire. But when they do drive away and they get to a diner, which is however many miles away, and the TV's still on, and they say that all of those things that they had just seen on the news happen, they all have magically stopped. So it
Really?
worked. It worked. Yeah, they saved the world.
There you go, kids.
Yeah,
Now you know.
knock at the cabin.
I'll check it out. Honestly, even though you
Yeah, I
totally
mean,
spoiled it for me.
it's on Amazon
Now
Prime, so if you have
yeah,
Amazon
I'll go
Prime, you can
watch it.
watch it,
It
you
got
know.
reasonably good reviews, I think, when it came out, so
Yeah,
now I know.
there you go. But why did we bring it up? Where's the sacrifice? If it's not clear, obviously, you have the visitors themselves, which again, that almost gives like some legitimacy. Like they're not just, I mean, they're crazy. I mean, obviously from the our perspective and the characters' perspectives, but in one sense, they're not because it's actually working, right? When these things happen, or when they don't happen, when they don't agree to make the sacrifice, the bad things happen. So in one
Mhm.
sense, they're not crazy. They're making a lot of sense. Um, but they're also sort of I mean, I
Do
don't
they
know.
offer
I guess like
is any of this, like, supposedly from, like a Christian angle? I mean, like, what because it doesn't really sound like it, right? It sounds like it's more of like a
yeah.
cabin in the woods, like, sacrifice must be
So
made to appease the
well,
gods kinda thing. Like, why
so I
how
mean,
do they offer explanation for what's going on?
Like, is this just like the Bible or something? Well, so they have one scene where there's a conversation where one of the 4 visitors is like, "I know what you're thinking. Are we just some, like, religious, crazy people or fundamentalists or something?" She's like, "I actually never liked going to church as a kid. Like, I don't like any of that church stuff, but I can't deny what I've seen. I can't deny what
Hmm,
the visions I've had." So
I
it's one
see.
of those where I feel like it's an M. Night Shyamalan movie, but, it's almost like he's trying to tell us modern, secular viewers, "No, don't worry, it's none of that, fundamentalist stuff. This is just a scary movie," sort of thing.
Interesting.
So maybe it is kinda like your cabin in the woods, like, "Oh, there's these ancient gods that we have to, appease," or something.
You know what would have been another really good story to talk about that we won't have time for now is Stephen King's The Stand.
I don't
You
know
ever
that
read any
one.
Stephen King?
No.
He's a really pretty good author, to be honest. But The Stand is an apocalypse book, and it's about
Okay.
plague wiping out all of humanity, and the remainder ends up in a climactic battle between good and evil.
Mm,
And there is a kind of sacrificial element at play in that story too, as a matter of fact.
yeah.
So one of these days we'll end up having to do something on The Stand.
Well,
There's a couple different TV versions of it now. So
so where this all kinda comes full circle, if we can, I guess, go through this in, like, 2 seconds or 2 minutes or whatever,
yeah,
but there actually is a full circle thing I wanted to bring all of this stuff back together, is,
okay.
we talked about it with Apocalypto, we talked about it with the Knock at the Cabin, but we also talked about this with a lot of just ancient cultures and their view of sacrifice and the end of the world, is we're a civilization that are making sacrifices to prevent the end of the world. Right?
Mm,
This is still
absolutely.
happening. This is still going on. And so that's sort of the, like when we make these movies or write these stories about it, it's not a reflection of how things used to be or of some made up thing. It's a reflection of us now
Well,
too.
can I tell you, I honestly believe this. I can't remember kind of when I started thinking about this, if I read it somewhere or I assume I try not to make stuff up for myself, right? Hopefully, this is inspired by something that I read and there's credibility behind it from the classical Christian tradition. But
Mhm.
basically, I think that on the day the last Christian dies, that's the end of the world, kind of thing. I
Mhm.
think that it only persists due to the prayers of the saints, right? And
That's the
so
Lord of the World ending of Lord of the World, by the way, of that
yeah,
movie.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So I don't think I'm making it up. I think other people
I
believe
mean,
this. I think this is
he's not he's not a church father, but, Saint Padre Pio, who he was a Franciscan priest in the, 1900s, he said something very similar to what you're saying. So, I mean, I'm not saying it's true because he said it, but I'm saying that it's not totally foreign to the Christian imagination to think of something like
well,
that.
and part of the reason why it's to get all of our references in this one episode,
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings, Tolkien talked about the long
Check.
defeat. Yeah, this is the
Yep.
most self-referential episode ever. The Lord, the long defeat. He has this idea of the long defeat in which
Mm.
we're all kind of and Lord of the Rings is suffused with this idea that like impending doom and you need eucatastrophe in order to so only God can save us from the long defeat,
Mhm.
right? And I think that's actually kind of like call me a cynic, but I think that we are in a long defeat and that,
Mhm.
I don't inherently anticipate the world to get better, at least not for Christians. And I think that
Christians fail upward, I think is they
yeah, there you
fail
go.
upward. Mhm.
But then the eucatastrophe occurs. The end of the world happens. Christ comes back. And honestly, Tolkien, like it's, I didn't get this from Tolkien. I got it from the book of Revelation, right? Revelation's not a happy book. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Revelation is nothing but like it all just goes bad, 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 bad. And then Jesus shows up and fixes it. Right. So,
Deus ex machina right there.
yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
the truest sense of it. Yeah, it's trying to
Yeah,
teach you
it's
grace.
true.
That's
And so,
um,
um, our sacrifices, our prayers, our Eucharistic devotion, our liturgy, this is the sacrifice. We're living the sacrifice of Christ in our lives when we do that. And we are saving the world
well
literally
well,
by
Jacob,
doing so.
go back to our book of Revelation. What was the sacrifice in that was the temple itself, right? If it's talking about the destruction of the temple, well, who is the temple now? It's like you said, it's the church. So
Yep.
the last Christian, right? That's going to be the destruction of the temple
Yeah.
on earth.
Yep.
Like that's the destruction of the temple on earth is the death of the last Christian,
Well,
and that's
and
gonna be the
Jesus
final.
is like, well, will the Son of Man find faith, when he returns,
Mm.
right? And the answer, I guess, is no.
Well, it was,
and that's why he's
I
going to
think,
come back,
I think
or he'll
we all
come
knew it
back
was,
and yeah.
I think we all knew it was rhetorical, Jacob. I think, it's
Okay,
so. Well, yeah. On that note, no, thank you for, I guess indulging me on this one. We'll say sacrificing your time, Jacob, for this
it's true,
conversation. Thank you
truly.
guys for coming to listen in. Going into this sort of end of the world and how it should help us then usher in, right, this resurrection or this new year, right, this new liturgical year. I know it feels weird to say that at the end of November because we're just going into December where we have the new year, but we don't live by Chronos, we live by Kairos, right? So we have this new year that we're going into as this liturgical cycle renews itself, right,
Yeah,
in the life of the
speak
world.
for yourself. That's a weird Catholic thing. You
Yeah,
guys
I
are
know. Yours
weirdos.
is different.
Yeah. Ours
That's-
makes
I
way
can live
more
with that.
sense than yours.
Moving.
I'm gonna go watch Pacific Rim.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.